The morning of June 3, 1851, dawned with deceptive gentleness over the Hampshire countryside. Pale sunlight filtered through a veil of high clouds, casting a soft glow upon the Whitcomb estate, a place that had not known true peace in generations, despite its manicured hedges and immaculate stone facade. For Eleanor Whitcomb, that morning marked the culmination of 23 years of preparation, discipline, and sacrifice. By nightfall, it would mark the end of the only life she had ever been allowed to imagine. In the east wing of the house, servants moved with practiced efficiency. Silver trays glided across corridors, silk rustled, whispered instructions passed from mouth to mouth. Hot water was carried upstairs. Fresh flowers, peonies and white roses flown in from London, were arranged with obsessive care. The house smelled of beeswax, starch, and expectation. Eleanor stood motionless before the tall cheval mirror in her childhood bedchamber while her maid, Hannah, fastened the final hooks of her wedding gown. The dress was exquisite without being indulgent. Ivory satin, French lace at the sleeves, a modest train that spoke of dignity rather than vanity. It had taken 6 months to complete and had been altered twice to satisfy her mother's precise vision of what a future countess should look like. "You look very calm, miss," Hannah said softly, smoothing the lace at Eleanor's shoulders. Eleanor met her own reflection. Calm, yes, but only because she had learned long ago that visible emotion was a weakness. Her face was composed, her posture perfect, her chestnut hair drawn into a style fashionable enough to impress but restrained enough to reassure. She had been trained for this moment since childhood, taught to carry herself as if the world were always watching. "I have prepared for this day my entire life," Eleanor replied. And it was true. Her education had never been indulgent. Languages before pleasure. Etiquette before curiosity. Silence before opinion. Her father, Lord Whitcomb, had made it clear that her value lay not in who she was, but in what she could secure. When the agreement with Earl Jonathan Harcourt had been arranged, sealed quietly when Eleanor was still a child, it had been spoken of as a triumph. The Harcourt title was old, powerful, respectable. And Jonathan, though distant and reserved, was deemed suitable. Affection, Eleanor had learned, was optional. Respect was not. By the time the church bells began to ring, the estate was alive with arriving carriages. Guests in silk and wool stepped onto the gravel drive, their voices bright with anticipation. This was to be one of the most notable weddings of the season. A union of stability, of lineage, of advantage. Inside the chapel, Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her gaze fixed ahead. She did not look at the guests, though she could feel their attention pressing against her skin. She did not search Jonathan's face, though she knew exactly where he stood. She walked as she had been taught, slowly, gracefully, without hesitation. Jonathan Harcourt waited at the altar, tall and impeccably dressed, his expression unreadable. He did not smile when he saw her, but that was not unusual. He was known for his restraint, his seriousness, his practicality. The ceremony began. The vicar's voice echoed gently against the stone walls. Eleanor listened, responding when required, her voice steady. She felt the weight of generations upon her shoulders, the women before her who had stood in this place and surrendered their futures with the same quiet obedience. Then came the moment. "Do you, Jonathan Harcourt, take this woman?" There was a pause. A hesitation so brief that at first Eleanor thought she had imagined it. Then Jonathan spoke. "I cannot." The words fell into the chapel like a dropped glass, sharp, final, impossible to ignore. A murmur rippled through the guests. Eleanor turned slowly, her heart thundering, though her face remained still. Jonathan did not look at her. Instead, he turned deliberately, publicly, toward the front pew where Marianne Whitcomb, Eleanor's younger cousin, sat frozen in shock. "I have reconsidered," he continued, his voice low but clear. "It would be dishonest to proceed when my heart is elsewhere. I believe Marianne possesses the youth and disposition better suited to the role I must fulfill." Silence. Then chaos. Gasp. Whispers. Eleanor felt them like physical blows. Her mother made a strangled sound and had to be steadied. Her father's face flushed a deep, furious red. Marianne's hands trembled in her lap, her eyes darting between Jonathan and Eleanor in horrified disbelief. For a moment, just one, Eleanor felt her knees weaken. But she did not fall. She had been taught too well. Jonathan finally turned to her then, his expression almost apologetic, as though he were declining a business proposal rather than dismantling a life. "You are an accomplished woman, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I am certain you will find contentment elsewhere." Elsewhere. As though 23 years of devotion could simply be redirected. Eleanor felt something inside her fracture, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. She reached up and removed the pearl necklace from her throat. His gift. Delivered that very morning. She held it out to him. "I believe this belongs with your chosen bride," she said. Her voice did not shake. Jonathan accepted the necklace, visibly unsettled by her composure. He had expected tears. "Please. Collapse." She offered none of it. Turning to Marianne, Eleanor inclined her head with controlled precision. "I wish you joy of your choice," she said. "May it bring you everything you deserve." The emphasis was subtle, but it landed. Then, without waiting for permission, Eleanor gathered her train and walked back down the aisle alone. The same path she had entered as a bride became her exit as a cautionary tale. She could hear the whispers already forming. Too old. Too severe. Rejected at the altar. An embarrassment. Outside the chapel, the sunlight felt cruelly bright. Eleanor took one step, and then another, and then the strength she had been borrowing finally failed her. Hannah caught her just in time, wrapping a cloak around her shoulders. "Where shall we go, miss?" she whispered urgently. Eleanor swallowed, her throat burning. "Not home," she said. "Take me away from here." The carriage door closed, sealing her inside the small, suffocating space. As the wheels began to turn, Eleanor allowed herself one final glance through the window. Jonathan stood beside Marianne now, already being congratulated, already forgiven. The crowd adjusted itself with alarming speed. Society always did. As the estate disappeared behind them, Eleanor Whitcomb pressed her gloved hands together and stared ahead. She did not cry. Not yet. But she understood, with devastating clarity, that the life she had prepared for since birth was over. And she had no idea who she was meant to be without it. Eleanor Whitcomb arrived in Bath 3 days after her wedding day, not as a guest nor as a daughter welcomed home, but as a problem quietly relocated. The house that received her belonged to her father's widowed cousin, Mrs. Eleanor Fenton, a woman whose fortune was modest and whose reputation was deliberately unremarkable. The selection was not accidental. Bath was respectable enough to avoid scandal, distant enough to discourage curiosity, and dull enough that Eleanor's presence would not invite conversation. Her father's letter had been brief. "It is best that you remain away for the present. Society has a short memory when not provoked." No inquiry into her health. No apology. No reassurance. Eleanor read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it in the bottom of her trunk, where it would remain untouched. The house on Henrietta Street was narrow and quiet, its rooms furnished for comfort rather than display. Mrs. Fenton greeted Eleanor with polite restraint and a visible effort not to stare at the ruined gown packed among her belongings. "You are welcome here for as long as you need," she said carefully. "Though I imagine it may not be long." Eleanor inclined her head. "I have no plans," she replied truthfully. That first week passed in a blur of physical exhaustion and emotional numbness. Eleanor slept poorly, waking from half-formed dreams in which she stood endlessly at the altar, unable to speak. During the day she walked the streets of Bath without direction, her bonnet pulled low, her posture automatically correct despite the fact that no one here knew her name. She was no longer observed with admiration. She was barely observed at all. At first, the anonymity felt like erasure. She had been trained to be noticed, evaluated, assessed, approved. Without that gaze, she felt unanchored, as though her existence had lost its outline. Meals were taken quietly. Conversation remained safe and shallow. Mrs. Fenton never mentioned the wedding, though Eleanor could feel the question hovering unspoken between them. At night, Eleanor allowed herself small, humiliating releases of grief. Silent tears pressed into a pillow. Long stares at the ceiling while her mind replayed Jonathan's voice. I cannot. She examined herself relentlessly. Had she been too reserved? Too serious? Too old at 23? The answers changed nothing, yet her mind returned to them again and again, as though repetition might soften the blow. It did not. 2 weeks after her arrival, Mrs. Fenton approached her one morning with visible hesitation. I have been asked, she began, whether you might assist me. Eleanor looked up from her tea. In what way? There is a charitable society here, Mrs. Fenton explained. A school for girls of working families. Their accounts are disorderly. They require someone literate. Organized. The implication was unmistakable. Not a lady's pastime. Or. Eleanor hesitated only briefly. I will help, she said. The schoolroom smelled of chalk and damp wool. The children stared openly at Eleanor's fine gloves and controlled manner, uncertain what to make of her. She, in turn, felt the unfamiliar discomfort of inadequacy, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she had never been expected to apply it usefully. The first ledger took her hours. She made mistakes. Corrected them. Learned. For the first time in her life, effort produced something tangible. The figures balanced. The records improved. The matron's relief was sincere. You have a talent for this, the woman said simply. No title. No expectation. Just fact. The work expanded slowly. Eleanor began assisting with correspondence, then scheduling, then modest negotiations with suppliers. It was not glamorous. It did not earn praise from society. But each small success created something unexpected within her, confidence rooted not in approval but in competence. The nights grew quieter. She began to sleep. Occasionally letters arrived from home. They were practical, restrained. Your sister Marianne is settled well. The matter appears to have lost novelty. Your absence has been noted favorably. Eleanor did not reply. Months passed. By autumn she had altered her wardrobe, simpler fabrics, fewer embellishments. Not from poverty but from indifference. She had stopped performing. It was during this period that she met Thomas Calder. He was introduced one afternoon by Mrs. Fenton as a man with an interest in civic improvement, which Eleanor would later recognize as a polite euphemism for someone who did not fit neatly into social categories. Calder was in his early 30s, plainly dressed, with ink-stained fingers and an unremarkable face made memorable only by his attention. He spoke to Eleanor as though her opinions mattered, not as a courtesy but as a given. Their conversations began cautiously. About schooling. About the limitations placed upon women by ignorance rather than ability. About the inefficiency of institutions governed by tradition rather than reason. Eleanor listened more than she spoke at first. When she did speak, she surprised herself. She had opinions. And they were informed. Calder never asked about her past. Never inquired after her title. Never looked at her as something fragile. It was unsettling. She found herself watching him as he spoke, not with longing but with curiosity. The idea of affection, true affection, still felt distant, almost inappropriate. She did not trust happiness. By winter, Eleanor had been offered a small stipend for her work. She accepted without ceremony. The independence it granted her felt more significant than the sum itself. She no longer waited for letters. She no longer rehearsed explanations. And yet, there were moments, passing a mirror, hearing a familiar name spoken by strangers, seeing a young woman in ivory silk. In those moments the old pain stirred, but it no longer ruled her. One evening, as Eleanor walked back through the lamplit streets of Bath, she realized something that stopped her in her tracks. She had gone an entire day without thinking of Jonathan Harcourt. The realization was not triumphant. It was quiet. Like the closing of a door she had assumed would remain open forever. Eleanor continued walking, her steps measured, her breath steady. She did not know what her future would hold. But for the first time it belonged to her. Eleanor Whitcomb returned to London in the spring of 1856, 5 years after the day she had been publicly unchosen. There was no announcement of her arrival. No carriage sent by her family. No eager anticipation waiting behind drawn curtains. She entered the city quietly, like someone who had learned that arrival did not require permission. London had not changed as much as she had expected. The streets were louder, perhaps. The faces sharper. But the same unspoken rules governed everything: who mattered, who did not, and who was allowed to be forgiven. Eleanor took rooms near Bloomsbury, modest but well-kept, paid for with money she had earned herself. She unpacked slowly, deliberately, noting how little she carried now. There were no relics of her former engagement. No preserved illusions. Her reason for returning was practical, not sentimental. Her father's health had declined. Legal matters required her presence. The Whitcomb estate, once so carefully ordered, had grown strained under mismanagement and pride. No one had asked if she wished to return. They had assumed she would. The first formal invitation arrived within a fortnight. A dinner. Respectable. Cautious. Curious. She accepted. The dining room fell silent when she entered. Not because she was unwelcome, but because she was unexpected. Eleanor moved with the same composure she always had, but there was something different now. She did not scan faces for approval. She did not brace herself for judgment. She listened, observed, responded when necessary. People watched her carefully. She was no longer the rejected bride. Not quite. She was altered. Whispers followed her through drawing rooms and corridors. She seems composed. Stronger, perhaps. Not bitter. That unsettled them more than anger would have. It was at one such gathering that she encountered Jonathan Harcourt again. He stood near the fireplace, older than she remembered. The sharp assurance he once carried had dulled. His marriage to Marianne, her cousin, had not produced the contentment he had promised society. When he saw Eleanor, something flickered across his face. Regret, unmistakable and uninvited. "Eleanor," he said later, approaching her with a careful smile. "You look well." "I am," she replied. They stood in polite silence for a moment. "I have thought of you often," Jonathan said quietly. "Of how things were handled." "I did not." She raised a hand gently. "You made a choice," she said. "I respected it then. I respect it now." He searched her face, perhaps hoping to find anger that might absolve him. "You were wronged," he insisted. "I was foolish. Young." She looked at him steadily. "You were not young," she said. "You were certain." The truth landed between them. Jonathan hesitated. "My marriage has been instructive," he admitted. "I have come to understand what I lost." Eleanor felt no triumph. Only clarity. "You lost someone who would have accepted a life she did not choose," she said. "That person no longer exists." He said her name again, softly this time. She smiled, not unkindly but definitively. "I wish you peace," she said and turned away. The conversation was already over. News of the exchange traveled quickly. So did Eleanor's refusal to re-enter old roles. When her mother suggested, carefully, that she might now seek a more suitable arrangement, Eleanor responded without raising her voice. "I am not seeking arrangement," she said. "I am living." Her family did not know what to do with that. It was during this period that Eleanor encountered Thomas Calder again. He had come to London on business, education reform, funding proposals, meetings with men who listened politely and promised nothing. Their reunion was unremarkable in appearance, but deeply significant in feeling. "You look settled," he observed as they walked through Russell Square. "So do you," Eleanor replied. They spoke easily, naturally, as equals. Over weeks their companionship deepened, not through grand gestures but through consistency. Calder respected her work, encouraged her independence, never once implied that marriage was her reward or her rescue. One evening as they sat reviewing papers by lamplight, he paused. "Eleanor," he said, "may I ask you something?" She looked up. "Do you believe happiness must arrive loudly to be real?" She considered this. "No," she said finally. "I believe it often arrives quietly, and we mistake that for insignificance." Calder smiled. "I was hoping you would say that." Their understanding grew without pressure, without spectacle. When he eventually spoke of affection, it was not a declaration. It was an offering. I care for you, he said simply. Not for who you were expected to be, but for who you are. Eleanor felt no fear. Only choice. Their decision to marry when it came was modest, private, undramatic. There were no grand chapels, no strategic alliances, no audiences waiting to approve. Only two people standing willingly. Years later, Eleanor would reflect that her true life had not begun with love, but with loss. That the day she had been unchosen had forced her to choose herself. Society eventually adjusted as it always did. But Eleanor no longer measured herself by its acceptance. She had built something quieter, and it endured.